Zoom event
Here
without
we go.
any of this. Here we go.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening, hello, and welcome to the MAPS panel on disability and equity in public service. For those of you who are new to MAPS National Network, MAPS stands for Muslim Americans in Public Service, and we are building a community of Muslim public servants across all levels of government, as well as creating a pipeline and facilitating professional development services for Muslims who aspire to join government, either as an appointee or civil servant. And you can find more information about MAPS and join our network on our website at www.mapsnational.org. My name is Nadia Hassan. I'm the Vice Chair of Muslim Americans in Public Service, and I have the pleasure of introducing the panel this evening. But I first want to say that my heart sunk when I read all of your bios. I am the mother of a young Muslima who has had a learning disability all of her life, and your stories have truly inspired me, and I'm awestruck by how each of you have been able to rise above and transcend your own personal disabilities and challenges to help others and transform the lives of people around you. You all have given me great hope, and for that, I say thank you. Thank you for all that you've done to make the world a better place, and thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. I will quickly introduce the panel now and turn it over to our moderator. First, we have Sara Minkara. Sara Minkara has been appointed a special advisor on international disability rights at the State Department. As the senior diplomat for disability rights, Sara leads the U.S. comprehensive strategy to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities internationally and across the department. Sara is a Lebanese American Muslim woman who acquired her disability at the age of 7. Sara incorporates her personal experience with disability in all of her work. She has dedicated her life to promoting inclusion as a value and to empowering others to reach their potential. Sara founded a nonprofit organization called Empowerment Through Integration, which offers children with disabilities essential life skills training. Sara earned her master's degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School, and she has been recognized for her many contributions through appointments and awards from numerous entities, more than I can enumerate in this hour. Welcome, Sara. Next, we have Mariyam Cementwala. Mariyam Cementwala is a first-generation immigrant who was the first in her family to complete college and graduate with a degree from UC Berkeley. Her formative years as a youth activist and advocate for marginalized groups define her approach to collaboration, coalition building, and DEIA initiatives. Mariyam is the first disabled Muslim American female recipient of the George J. Mitchell Scholarship. Mariyam's life experiences include representing American culture and values on 3 continents and being the youngest person in the room drafting the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Mariyam is currently the Senior Policy Advisor at the Secretary's Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the State Department, where she advises the leadership team on Biden's DEIA objectives and helps to implement policies that advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for over 76,000 employees and over 270 domestic and overseas posts. Next, we have Mohammed Yousuf, who is the Director in the Office of Infrastructure, Safety, and Asset Innovation at the Federal Transit Administration, where he oversees a portfolio of research and demonstration activities to advance innovations in the transit industry, including managing the FTA bus testing and the low-no cap centers. Prior to joining the FTA, Mohammed worked at the Federal Highway Administration as Research Transportation Specialist at the Office of Operations Research and Development, where he conducted research on connected and automated vehicles and accessibility transportation. He had also worked at General Motors and Chrysler Corporation in the areas of vehicle product development. He is the founder and president of the Equally Able Foundation and is the author of a memoir, Ascending Adversity. Welcome, Mohammed. And next, I'll introduce our moderator, Lobna Ismail, who also goes by Luby, is the founder and president of Connecting Cultures, where she offers expertise on cultural competency, religious diversity, Islamophobia, Arab culture, and disability rights. Luby provides in-depth training on DEIA initiatives to both U.S. government and the private sector. Her clients include federal and state agencies, education institutions, nonprofits, and corporations such as Microsoft, Walt Disney, the U.S. Department of Justice, and so many others. As a disability rights advocate, Luby has become a prominent voice for breaking down stereotypes and assumptions about those with disabilities of any kind. Luby has a master's degree in intercultural relations from Lesley University and is a published author of numerous articles and books. Luby is a keynote speaker and has been invited to present her work at conferences across more than 15 countries around the world. Also joining us today, and we're so happy to have them, two ASL interpreters, the first Robin Gearhart and the second Tara Watson. So welcome to everybody who is joining us. Before I turn it over to Luby, I'd just like to make two quick announcements. The first is all of our speakers are speaking in their own personal capacities this evening. And special advisor Sara Minkara has to leave early. And so we are going to start the discussion with Sara because I think she only has 15 or 20 minutes. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Lobna, to moderate the discussion.
Wow, thank you so much, Nadia. I am moved, I am honored, I am humbled by the incredible force of all of you, distinguished panel. I'm really excited to hear from all of you. I know in my work of over 2 decades, I've always said that stories have the way to transform the barriers of stereotypes. So I want to start with Sara, since your time with us is short. Sara, you have on your page on LinkedIn the quote, "Inclusion isn't a favor. I'm not a burden. I am an asset." So I want to start with you. What is a barrier that you have yourself experienced as a person with a disability in public service? What is a barrier that you have faced and that you may see others with disabilities face in public service?
Well, thank you so much, Luby, for that question. And I first want to thank Nadia, Ahmed, Maps, and also our my co-panelists, Mariyam and Mohammed. I'm really honored to be with you all and everyone that's tuning in. Luby, that's a really good question. What is a barrier that I face in my public service? I'm going to take a step back and actually illustrate 2 stories that kind of will signal the what I mean by a barrier that I'm going to talk about in a sec. So when I was in grad school, I was in a classroom full of 100 students, and each student had a name card, and that allowed for classmates to interact but in a more productive way. So in the beginning of the semester, I told everyone, can you please say your name when you speak? That's going to help me access the classroom. That would be really great. The professor takes a step back and he's like, no. And I was like, what do you mean no? This is my right. And he said, the way you phrase it is as if they're doing you a favor by making the classroom accessible to you. It's actually the other way around. By them making the classroom accessible to you, by you being able to access the class, by you being able to contribute, you're able to bring forward your value. And that way they will be benefiting from what you're bringing forward. That was a huge turning moment for me because society in many ways has made us feel like accessibility and accessing the system, which is made in many ways inaccessible for persons with disability, as if it's an add-on, as a burden, as a favor, etc. But the way he phrased it, it is you are bringing value and society is going to benefit from that. And that goes into the public service world and every other sector. In many ways, we're still entering systems and spaces that is not accessible, not made, in a way that allows us to go forward and access. And then we're going to have to advocate. And when we advocate, it's seen as if we're asking for too much or we're add-on or we're different, instead of seeing it from a point of, hey, let's really make sure we're providing a space that this person can bring their value. And this is why we don't see a lot of leaders in public service and other sectors with disabilities, because half our time we are advocating. So that's one aspect. And another aspect is, you know, another small example, I was a math major in college, and classmates would come up to me and say, Sara, what classes are you taking next semester? And I'd be like, oh, why does that matter? And they're like, well, whenever you're in the classroom, the professor becomes a better teacher. That in itself is a really important lesson in terms of when we make a setting and a space accessible for persons with disability, everyone benefits. And that is a narrative that's still far from being seen or heard or brought forward in the systems and spaces we're in.
Excellent. Wow, what really different perspective, and also that making it accessible is about not just people with disabilities, but how it makes it for all people. Thank you. What about this question? What unique perspective or experience do you bring to public service? What unique perspective or experience do you yourself bring to public service?
I think as a blind Muslim, second generation Arab American woman that's an entrepreneur, right? I'm a person with many identities, and everyone in this room has so many different identities, and those identities bring so much value, you know, and I can dissect every single one of them and talk about what different values we bring forward. But being a person with a disability, because that's the topic of the session, we as people with disabilities, as individuals, we bring a lot of creativity and innovation, and in terms of and also in many ways perseverance and so much to the system at hand. And I think the system in seeing that value can really help the work at hand. Then take the other layers. As a human, we're all humans, you know, with other identities that can add on. I feel like being an entrepreneur and having started a nonprofit and also a consultancy company, that's helped me become very resourceful in the system I'm currently in, and being able to really network and build relationships and really mobilize certain things. So I think it depends on each person. And I think it goes back to this point of how do we really turn our identities and seeing them from our own inner voice and strength instead of how society sees our own identities.
So, and definitely I'm hearing the sense of looking at a place of the potential that you bring. And too often, I know myself living with multiple sclerosis, too often people think they see me through a lens of pity rather than a sense of what you can bring in addition, and so the potential in which you bring. Okay.
And I think, sorry, that's and to your point, it's so important. I think this is where I always ask people, like, we're all on this journey of, you know, self-reflection and really trying to understand, are we seeing our identities through our own lens or through how society is seeing us? And how do we really try to understand and see our identities through a lens of strength, beauty, value? But that's a constant journey. It's not a switch of a button. And to be honest, there are moments where I do, you know, let external perspectives and perceptions to enter how I see myself. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Sara, mashallah. All right. I would like to go to the next question, which is why, I mean, you kind of started to get to this. Why do you believe that there are so few people with disabilities in positions of particular leadership that are with disabilities?
That's a really good question. So a combination of things. One is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of us, you know, as persons with disabilities, a lot of time we're spending half our time advocating for our accommodations and accessing the system. And to be honest, we just want to do our job. So when we're spending a lot of time on advocating for accessing the system, I think it takes away from us being able to reach the leadership level. That's number one. Number two, also, you know, just from an entry level perspective or any level, a lot of times persons with disabilities doubt whether they can, if they're going to enter the system or they're going to succeed, right? There's a lot of doubt. And I think this is where I always say to any agency and system, be proactive, reach out to the disability community and really make it in a way that, you know, the system sees the value in bringing the disability community forward. The third layer also, a lot of times the system at large pigeonholes us in terms of where we can do our, where we can be of value. You know, they see me as a person with a disability and say, okay, great, go and do disability related stuff. Sorry, but yes, nothing about us without us. But I always take it a step further and say nothing without us. We need to be across all sectors and all spaces and really just be seen as humans with value that we can bring forward. And I think being pigeonholed is a common thing as well.
Too often, again, going back to where society thinks you fit, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you can't do. I always say that we've got the letter C across our chest, which is can, and they take off that apostrophe T and make it about can.
Yes.
All right.
If I may interject just for a second, Luby, Sara is going to be leaving us. If anybody has a question from the audience, please drop it in the chat box now because she's going to be departing in a few minutes. So this would be your time to ask your question for Sara.
Okay. I really would love to get this question. What is one, I mean, I've always because too often we're in a position, like you said, advocating. What would you say is a way that others who are outside of the disability world, how can they really be an ally, an advocate, an accomplice for people with disabilities?
That's a really good question, Luby. I think a couple of things. I think one is understanding you know, I would say within the concept of disability inclusion, there needs to be this concept of shared responsibility, that we all have a piece in it. Even if we think it doesn't touch us, it does touch us, right? And I think that really first understanding that one, it's, you know, it should be part of my world, my work, my you know, my efforts, right? Whether we are an employer or manager, whether we are working on climate change, whether I'm a teacher or an engineer or whatever, right? It should be part of kind of the work I'm doing, and really understanding how that might look like. Number two is allyship to our colleagues of persons with disabilities. You might not know you have a colleague with a person with a disability because there's a lot of invisible disabilities. I always say, like, you know, with your colleagues, and if you're a manager with your employees, ask the question, what do you need as a person? Just say, what do you need as a person to be able to thrive in this working setting? And see what they might need and see how you can support and be an advocate for that, right? Without creating any assumptions. And the third part is, I would say we are all humans. We are part of creating assumptions and narratives in society. I would also reflect on how am I contributing to some of these narratives? And then on the other hand, how are these narratives contributing to how I'm seeing disability? Ultimately, if I can pick one of them, just understand we all have the power to create a more empowering space for ourselves and others. So ask your colleague the next time, what do you need as an individual to thrive in this working setting?
Amazing. Sara, we have one question from the audience and then we're going to let you go. And I'm sorry if we held you up too much, but Ahmed asks, in your experience and opinion, which country or city is the best in providing physical and digital accessibility for people with disabilities?
So, I mean, each country has its pluses and minuses, and it's really hard for me to say which country or city I would pinpoint. Because, you know, you can look at a country and look at Tokyo and Japan and say, well, it's great public transportation, but then you can look at from another perspective. So it's hard to say, but I will tell you something. In traveling the world, and it's more of a general, not in terms of digital technology or physical accessibility, but when traveling the world, we, the US, are still leaders when it comes to disability inclusion because of our ADA, because the enforcement provisions and our law and legislation in terms of how it's carried out, we're still in many ways leaders. We're not saying we're perfect. There's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of further enhancements in terms of kind of how we implement some of these laws. But I remember in Germany, when I was in Germany a few months ago, you know, they were looking towards us and saying, hey, we still need to learn from the ADA in the US in terms of how they're implementing their law. So I can go, there's so much to talk about each every country I've visited, but anyways, I hope that answers the question. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Nadia, and thanks, Luby. And I hope to see you guys all in person someday.
Yes.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you. Jazakallah khair. All right, let's go to our other panelist here. You've heard our questions, and maybe this has kind of got you thinking about some of the ways in which it might be similar, but also to add on to the depth of some of the experiences you yourself have had. So I'd like to start with Mariyam. Mariyam, what about for you in terms of what has been a barrier or barriers that you yourself experience in public service? And as Sara, it can be through story or in general.
Mariyam, we can't hear you. You're muted. We still can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Mariyam.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Terrific. And so I just want to make sure you can see and hear me.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. And once again, I want to thank Ahmed for thinking of us, and Luby for moderating this, and Nadia as well for organizing. And Sara is a wonderful and dynamic colleague here at the State Department. So we're lucky to have her with us. And Mohammed, looking forward to hearing from you as well on this question and others. I too want to start off with a story, because I think that when we think of barriers, whether they're in public service or even prior to that, the barriers are largely attitudinal first. Because before we can overcome structural barriers or physical barriers or technological barriers, we have to overcome the attitudes of stigma and misconception and myth that surround the word disability. I like to start by asking the question, and I'd love to have this response from you all in the chat. What's the first word you often think of when you hear the word disability? And Luby, if you don't mind just sharing what some of the participants are saying in kind of a rapid response, just 3 or 4 folks, if you could jump in quickly and say, what's the first word that you think of or that, comes to your mind immediately when you hear the word disability?
First thought. So we have from Ahmed, capability. Okay. What else? What are some other? And this is not that you're being
so blind. The other one I like to do is what's the first word you think of when you hear the word blind?
Well, I'm going to share some of
Please.
the respectability, ability, less, can't travel, can't work.
Exactly. The what you see there is a really interesting combination, because you got respectability, you got capability, and that's coming from a place of thinking about inclusion and being informed. But most often what you hear is can't see, can't do, lesser, less capable. And, you know, when I think about disability and I think about the attitudes, I think back to, you know, my own mom and my own dad and the differences between them. My dad was very much of the opinion that, you know, I want my daughter to be someone who isn't looked upon as the, quote, poor thing, close quote, right? The word in Gujarati is bichari, right? And so he didn't want me to be that. My mom, on the other hand, was told things like, she's blind because you did something wrong. You committed a sin. And so there's a lot of stigma associated even in families, right? With respect to how disability is viewed. And then you go into your education, your career, whether it's public service or the private sector. I mean, Sara told that beautiful story about, you know, her professor, right? And her professor teaching her the value that she innately and intrinsically possesses. And that happened to me in a similar way too, because I was working at a law firm called Protection and Advocacy when I was in college at UC Berkeley, and I was working on inclusive education for children with disabilities. And my mentor, Steve Rosenbaum, said to me, Mariyam, I want you to remember something in this work. I want you to remember that it is not just the student with the disability who is in a classroom who benefits from being in that classroom. It is all of the other students and the teacher who benefit from having the student in that classroom. It was almost verbatim what, you know, the ethos that Sara's professor shared. And I learned that too. And I learned that from someone else, right? Like someone outside of me. That hadn't occurred innately to me because I was like, oh, it's my right. I'm fighting for a right. I'm fighting for these people's rights, right? You know, my people's rights. But why do we have to think of it in that framework? Well, unfortunately, we have to think of it in that framework because people don't get the value of what we bring. And one of the barriers experienced in public service was just this idea that as a diplomat, you know, in my day job, that I would bring value and I had to deliver over and over. And one of the things that I did in my many postings is I was called a prolific writer. I had the most cables, you know, if you think of the Kennan telegram, you know, I had the most cables at one of my posts in a year within my section sent to Washington, D.C. And why that was, is I was able to connect with people. I had linguistic skills, I had cultural competencies, knowledge as a Muslim American in public service who happens to have a disability. Some would say, oh, you have the multiple whammy. You're Muslim, you're a woman, you're blind, you're brown, you know. And I would say to them, no, I'm a Muslim, I'm a woman, I'm blind, I'm brown. There's a lot of people with whom I can connect. And the currency of diplomacy is information. And what I'm good at is getting to and getting at the information, creating a sense of empathy, building trust, networking, and then that's how you get those cables to Washington. That's how you get into the presidential daily brief. That's how you get the secretary and the deputy secretary of state reading what you wrote, and President Obama, you know, looking at the work, you know, that's part of the body of work to which you contributed and deciding to make a speech in India on human rights. So there's a lot of value in what we bring to public service, but whether it's our religious identities, our gender, our nationalities, and our, you know, our ethnicities, rather, our nationality is American, but the ethnicities and the cultural competencies we bring, and our disabilities, we bring capacity and we bring a lot to the table.
Wow, you've really packaged so much in there. I mean, you are the diversity poster child, and that's I mean, I like the way you also said the currency of diplomacy of what you bring in, how much that's so critical. And I think, you know, as a person with a disability, too often society just sees that, but yet there's so much more about who you are. And it's only through the relationships is what I'm hearing. And it's what they see, what you can do, what you offer. Once they realize they can see beyond the different ability of what they first see, that they're able to see your incredible contributions and attributes that you have. All right, I'd like to also hear from Mohammed. Mohammed, we haven't heard from you. What would you like to add to this rich discussion around barrier that you yourself have either experienced or have witnessed or seen at your agency or in general around for people with disabilities?
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much to Maps, to Nadia, to Lobna, and Mariyam, and Sara. Like it is great to be honored to be with you all on this panel, and to our audience and the participants, you know, thank you for being with us and giving up your evening, you know, for this session here. Well, there's so much that has already been said, and it's hard to like come in now and add, you know, but maybe a couple of stories again, you know, one with what we have heard so far, from stereotypes to the stigma, you know, these are all things that resonate so very well with me. And I say this, that it is a blessing in a disguise that some of that had happened, and this is why. So like, I had polio as a child, and like any individual with a disability, we all have our stories and our struggles. But even despite all of that, I had an engineering degree in India. And from what I recall is back then, for a person with a physical disability to be in an engineering discipline was somewhat unique, you know, and that I had seen in the college or the wherever the school that I was going. But what surprised me the most was that after I had graduated, I was now hoping that I'd be offered a job as an engineer, or be able to have a career, you know, that you have wished for, you know. And now I struggled for 2 years to find the right employment. In India, back then, they were willing to offer me a job as an administrative assistant, as a telephone operator. But no one saw me fit to do the duties of an engineer. And that really led me to thinking of leaving India, and that is why I'm in the US. In the public service, I think the issue is not so much of facing a barrier, but not knowing about the barriers, because there is still so few of us in the public service. But once people know about our, like Sara mentioned, like Mary mentioned, you have to be an advocate. But once the barriers or the issues are brought forward, to a large extent, bearing a few things that is very hard to modify or to rectify, you seem to still be able to get the help from the organizations that you work for in the US federal government.
So, Mohammed, I want to ask you, Mariyam had shared about, you know, it's people's attitudes. And you were saying that you faced that back in your country of origin. But here in the United States, Do you also deal with attitude as a barrier that people have of you living with a disability? And how have you been able to break through that barrier, if that is one, of attitude towards you as a person with disability in your jobs or in public service in general? And what would you recommend to others?
Yeah, that's generally true of any individual story that you look at, that you have occasions, where you face the attitudinal. I think the broader issue is with not having enough role models or success stories. So the general perception in the communities, in the world is, if you see a person with a disability, or ABC is a draw on the society, they can't really contribute. And so I had to go through some of that, in that there is a tipping point. And I think to what Sara mentioned and to Mariyam, what I want to add is, like, you almost have to start at level zero. Nobody expects you to, when I say nobody, for a person with a disability and for a person without a disability in the marketplace, generally the value assigned to a person with disability is different. You have to come in there and prove yourself. Then the whole tide shifts. And that happens in workplace, a function or an event, even a gathering that you go to. And that has to change. And I want to say that has been the case because of the media representation, the narratives that you see. But some of that is starting to shift. And there's a very good report that was done by Accenture with Microsoft called Getting to Equal. That really put a value on, like, if you employ X number of people with disability, you transition them from unemployment to employment. This is kind of the difference that you're going to see, not only in the society, but in GDP and other areas. I think we need more of that to just put a value, a cost benefit on what people with disabilities, the innovations, the creativity that they bring, and how could you equate that to. Now, to your question, Luby, our attitude, it's a difficult thing to really measure that, but a lot of the hesitation and to a large extent, the obstacles that we see is about that. And you could go and fix an inaccessible workplace, the physical barriers, but it is very difficult to work on the attitudes or the soft side of the barriers that we see in society and in workplaces and other areas.
Definitely. One of the things, I agree with you. I know that the mindfulness of being able to provide accessibility in designs of products, of services, in construction, all of these prevents costly retrofits later, right? But I want to say that one of the things is, in general, we say that 1 of every 5 Americans are living with a disability, right? And with the aging population, we are going to only see more people living with disability. So with that, the market is going to have to more and more provide and see the people's needs, right? So with that, I'd like to go to the next questions that we had asked of Sara, but also now to Mariyam. Mariyam, what would you say are ways in which we could get more people in positions, higher positions of leadership in public service? What would you say is most important? How can we get Mariyam? You are someone who has said the currency of diplomacy is in information. You're getting all these cables. How can we get someone like you maybe in the future to become Secretary of State, to rise? What's it going to be to get people, more and more people with disabilities in higher leadership positions?
I think that's an incredibly important question, and one that I wrestle with every day, because in my current work, what I see is that, it's easy to find diversity at the bottom ranks of the federal sector or at the private sector, and then as you get, inch upwards in that pyramid. In any case, it's a pyramid structure, but even in that pyramid structure, diversity indications go down, right? And so there are several things that are really, really important. From a structural standpoint, data is really important, and tracking data is really important. Creating pipelines is really important. So that means people like me have to be involved in people's work, organizational work like this, the work of MAPS, to say, come, join, and let me help you, let me pay it forward. And that, I was going to say, actually relates to a point I was going to make on your previous question, which is, how do you break down attitudinal barriers, right? You all face them. How do you break them down? And that actually speaks to this question, which is, how do you get to see people at the top? The first thing is recognize your worth, because no one else will recognize it for you unless you do not do that yourself. Let me illustrate a quick story.
Yes.
I was at my first post. Okay, I was at my first post, and I was in a taxi, and I was going to the embassy. And by the way, I speak in my personal capacity. I just want to restate that. But I was going to the embassy, I was going to work. And I mean, I could have worked at the embassy. I could have worked at, another big company in this country. And I was going to work, and the person asked me, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to this embassy. And the person assumed, the taxi driver assumed that I was going to the second entrance. And I clarified, actually, I'm going to the first entrance. Second entrance is the visa entrance. The first entrance is the staff entrance. The taxi driver assumed I'm blind, I must not know better. Then the taxi driver played this game of asking me, where are you from? And it was in a different language than English. And so I played the game right back and said, well, why don't you guess where I'm from? And this person guessed every country under the sun in the Middle East and South Asia, and finally got frustrated with me and said, why don't you just tell me where you're from? And I said, well, where are you going? He said, well, I'm going to the American Embassy. And I said, that's right. That's where I'm from. And he said, what? How can that be? You're a Muslim woman. You're in a hijab. You're blind. How do they let you work there?
Oh,
and
my.
I said, smiling, and this is the other piece, have humor, because you will face microaggressions. Have humor and grace as you educate. I said, it's not about whether they will let me work there. It's not about how they let me work there. It's about the fact that why they let me work there. They don't let me work there. They want me to work there. They need me to work there because I bring something to the table that many of them can't and don't. In my language skills, in my cultural competencies, in my regional knowledge, in my political acumen about, the country, the diversity of the country, the different cleavages in the country, the political sophistication that I bring to the understanding of the work that we're doing is something that, because they don't have that lived experience, they can't, right? It's not going to be the same. But I recognize my value. So now to the second thing, what do? You recognize your value, that's great. Now, if you want to get to that leadership position, chase sponsors. It's not enough to say, I'm going to have a mentor. No, I need sponsors to champion me, to put me in the position to get that next job, to elevate me and understand power and privilege in the sponsorship game. Because people at a senior level, and when we get to that senior level, we need to remember this. People at the senior level have the power to elevate a message and the privilege to be heard. When you get there, don't forget that. I haven't forgotten it even now, and I wouldn't say at the senior levels in the same way that Sara is, because she's a political appointee, but I am on the 7th floor of the State Department. And when people come to me with their stories of inequity, of injustice, of exclusion, I elevate those messages up and try to solve problems, because I understand that with my power comes immense privilege, and with that comes an immense responsibility. And I'm not going to be able to see myself or others like me at the top if I don't build coalitions, if I don't help sponsor people myself, and if I don't find sponsors myself. And third, and most important, pay it forward, which is, you know, all of us have a responsibility to do that. Those of us who've reached a certain level especially have the responsibility to do that. And those of you, right, you who are not disabled or temporarily non-disabled, have a responsibility to pay it forward too. Because if you want to see the diversity of lived experience at the top, then you have to pay it forward by being intentionally inclusive, right? You have to hear us, not just listen, but hear us, champion us, be our sponsors, and that is how we will pay it forward collectively, by seeing more Muslim Americans with disabilities at the top. Because why wouldn't I? Why shouldn't I be an ambassador? When I was a George Mitchell Scholar, one of my colleagues told me back then, why would you ever go into diplomacy? Why would that even be a consideration as a career in the future? And I was just like toying with the idea at the time. And I said, well, why not? And she said, because I would never pick you to be an ambassador. You represent vulnerability. And when I want to put the best face of America forward, I want to show strength. And I thought to myself, this person is interestingly naive, because when we show our vulnerabilities, and you can listen to tons of TED Talks on trust, but when we show our vulnerabilities, we build trust. I said earlier, the currency of diplomacy is trust, and the essence of, the currency of diplomacy is information, which you cannot get without trust. And the essence of diplomacy is empathy. And when you show empathy, you build trust. And who better than a person with a variety of lived experiences to bring to the table to build trust, build empathy, and get at the information we need to strengthen our national security architecture.
Mariyam,
So with that, over.
thank you so much, Mariyam. I mean, you reminded me of so much in there. You reminded me of my trainings I did with Americans that were being deployed to the Middle East. And I said the greatest barrier that they were facing was the letter A. I mean, as you all could tell, I could talk about those letters across our chest. I said it was the letter A, arrogance, across our chest, and that they needed to shift that A to an H, to humility. And to be able to convey that humility. And in a way, what I'm hearing is, like you're saying, our vulnerability. And many of the messages that you're saying also reminds me of what women talk about, what they need in order to break through that glass ceiling, to rise to the top. It's no different, is finding those sponsors, or getting the men who have the power, who are at the top, to be able to bring me along. Don't forget me when people are talking about who's going to be at the next, at that position Hear me. Don't just forget me. Okay. This is painful because there's so much rich discussion here. I'm also seeing from Zach, please consider neurodiversity when discussing healthcare. That yes, people process information differently. I mean, you know, we too often when we think about disability, we're thinking about the physical disabilities that we can see, but that there's much in terms of what we don't see, and that the ways in which I know many people, adults that are dealing with a range of ways in which they come into public service, into the workplace. I don't know, does any, Mohammed, would you like to add into this discussion about allyship?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, there is already so much that Mariyam has shared, you know. But I think we all have a responsibility for some of us who are in the public service and in even in positions, you know, of leadership, to have almost think of a pipeline, you know, to bring our youngsters, youth, and be of help as much as possible. But to what Mariyam was talking about, the sponsorship and allyship, that is huge. You know? In my previous job, my supervisor used to say, like, you need to move up. You know, that's only when you could make kind of undertake some key projects or have some key decisions. You know, he was all encouraging all the time about keep going up. And I think we need to be proactive, but also be heard and do as much as possible, you know. And one way to do that, and none of us do that, you know. But instead of always coming across as someone who is complaining, you know, we need to be on the other side and see the type of differences or the changes that we could bring. And let our senior leaderships and other know, you know, there is always a space for a different voice or a different idea that has otherwise been not known or heard.
Thank you. Yes.
Luby, I was just pinged. Our interpreters have to leave exactly at 7 p.m. So they just have a couple more minutes. I just wanted to, our event is supposed to wrap up at 7, but if anybody has any last minute questions, please drop them in the chat box so that we can get to them. Just wanted to let you know, Luby. Sorry to interrupt.
So there is one I see here. From Ahmed to all of us. Not all sovereign nations have codified legal protections and regulations for the disabled, like the United States. How can we work to educate and inform Muslim immigrant brothers and sisters to conform and uphold these protections? For IG or EG, there are no questions on the citizen state educating our newest Americans about ADA. What would you say?
I think that's an excellent question, because not only do immigrants come with a different conception of the law and legal frameworks and rights, they can also come with a very different conception of attitudes. And it's not that the attitudes were prevailingly different, right? If you think about the United States and its history with the ugly laws, right? And what other countries are experiencing right now in terms of the evolution of their disability rights movements, it's just that we've had a longer history. We've been very fortunate with champions like Judy Heumann, like Tony Coelho, like Kenneth Jernigan, I mean, you know, like Jacobus Tembrick. I mean, we've had a long, long history. And we have benefited from that history. And other countries are in a different place and a different moment in time in their history. So we need to recognize that and recognize that with some humility. But then we need to say, when people do come here, right, we need to involve, as Muslim Americans in public service particularly, you know, we have unique access to civil society in the United States. We have unique access, for instance, through MAPS and its larger networks, right, to immigrant community groups. And, you know, when you have occasions like July, ADA month, or October, National Disability Employment Awareness Month, it's reaching out to those networks and saying, hey, have you thought about putting on a symposium or a talk or a panel like this about disability among Muslim communities in the United States, so that people can tell their stories, talk about stigma to success, right? Because when a mom of a kid who's growing up in West Texas or in Northern California or in the middle of Iowa or suburban Chicago, who happens to be Muslim American, sees you or me, even though she just came from country X or Y, her perception of the possible is going to change. The ADA changed our laws. The Rehab Act changed our laws, but the stories is what is going to change the hearts and minds. And this is a game about convincing hearts and minds, because if you get there first and you show the communities that there's value in inclusion, then law aside, they're going to want to do that because it's good for business.
It's good for business.
It's good for society.
So,
It's good for their civil rights.
Mariyam, absolutely. In the interest of time, I have to pause here for our interpreters, but I agree fully. And I think that we have no question what's good for some is good for all, because people with disabilities crosses race, crosses religion, crosses skin color, crosses national origin, crosses gender, crosses all groups. People with disabilities are the most diversity group. So it's not about some of us, but about all of us. And thus I say that we need to just keep on keeping on with our voices and getting, I like the word sponsors. I'm going to add that to Beyond Mentors. So with that, I'm going to let Nadia take this. And I see Zach has a question. Zach, maybe if you look at add my email, Nadia, connecting-cultures, Luby at connecting-cultures.net. I can answer that around cultural competence and the Eastern view, of medicine, conflict with Western views, and culture, how cultural competence should be considered. Because I've just delivered a training for the Minneapolis Children's Hospital around this issue.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luby. Thank you. I want to thank everybody here, and I'm going to turn, and just in regards to the email address, I'm posting my email here. I'm happy to share anybody's contact info. Oh boy, I did not do that right. I will get my email in here, and we will share if it's okay to share speaker email addresses. Is that okay, Mohammed and Mariyam?
Yes.
And Luby, yeah, we'll also share yours. I'm going to turn it over to our chair, who will give thanks to everyone. There's so much that goes into putting these events. So Ahmed, if you are there, please come online so we can close out the program with you, if you are there.
Yes,
Um,
no,
Yes.
I'm not sure if my video is still choppy, but I wanted to echo Nadia's thanks to all of you and much appreciated. Keep on shining and representing our community. And inshallah, thank you all for this.
Yes, and I'm dropping my email in now. Feel free to reach out to myself, to Ahmed. Again, thank you, Mariyam. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Luby. Thank you to the ASL interpreters and Sara. I will send her. I'm going to send everybody a special thank you. And our sponsors, Ahmed, do you want to mention a quick thank you to our sponsors who made this tonight possible?
Yeah.
If you're able.
Mohsen, Islamic Scholarship Fund, and includes and American health professionals. Thank you all.
All right. Have a good night. I've dropped my email in the chat box. Luby, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Goodbye to everyone.
Oh, goodbye.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Thank you. This was
Thank you
wonderful.
all. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.